Now, our country focus today is Sudan, where fighting between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces over power tussle has reached 5 weeks. Will both parties reach a compromise? There are details for you in this report.
It's been 5 weeks since the fighters fired the first salvo. The Sudanese war with its theater in the capital city, Khartoum, still raging on. The Sudanese armed forces have been at arms against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, and both parties are not willing to reach a compromise. Despite calls for a ceasefire, both forces continue to shell each other, and the innocent Sudanese have become victims of a bitter feud. The country has moved from long years of military carnage to a short stint of civilian governance, back to the military and a war of battle-willing, relentless, poison-hardened generals. While the power tussle has sent Sudan, just recovering from decades of security challenges, into deeper chaos, current challenges are offshoot of contentious security decisions of the past. As the world continues to watch the situation in Sudan and evacuate its citizens from the war theater, the genesis of the problem has become a step to the revelation of the solution. As another shot goes up in Sudan, a country that can be more, that should be more, is being taken to its knees by a battle for sheer supremacy. When will peace come?
Now, for better understanding of the conflict in Sudan, I am joined by Dr. Majduline Tahir. She's an expert in Sudanese geopolitics and advocate for democracy and human rights. She joins from Norway. I also have Ovigwe Eguegu, policy analyst at Development Reimagined. He joins me live from the Turkish capital, Ankara. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on the program.
Welcome.
Now, I'd like to start with you, Dr. Tahir. What's the latest in the fighting in Khartoum? Where is the fighting most concentrated? And do these warring parties have military objectives, or is it just a cat-and-mouse fight?
So far, military-wise, as a civilian observant, I see that both parties started off as being very weak in terms of training, logistics, and military equipment. They're even weaker now, getting into the 5th week. This is evidenced by the repeated theft for food that their exhausted soldiers, I have to say child soldiers, both parties are looting houses for food, and that is a reflection of the state of their soldiers and training and logistics. In terms of politically, they are still in this unlocked situation, whereby there was something called the Jeddah Declaration, which is basically one of many to come kind of deals and agreements, which we as civilians and civilian grassroots movement, we do not believe very much into it, because it didn't come with any kind of pressure on any party, and it didn't come with what we were hoping for, yet rather realistically not expecting, and that is a pressure to stop the guns, to stop the money getting into the hands of these murderous adventurers. And that didn't happen. Not that we expected it, but it just didn't happen again. So they would make any declaration which does not come with at any cost for them. It's just a piece of paper which they can violate at any time. If it had come with any kind of pressure, threats, or consequences, then perhaps that would deter them. That's on in terms of the comment on the Jeddah Declaration. The latest which had come today is that Burhan, who is a self-declared head of the transitional period, the Sovereign Council of the transitional period, has sacked his deputy, again, self-declared deputy, Hamdan Dagalo, from his position. And he made several changes in his military council and moved people around in his military council. And he started that last week by sacking the head of the police and replacing him with somebody else, which shows, again, a sign that SAF, which is the Sudanese Armed Forces, the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, there is a split and conflict in between them, and that there are different factions.
We'll get into the Jeddah talks and the current situation in the course of our conversation. Thank you very much for giving us an update on the current situation in Khartoum. I'd like to bring in Ovigwe in Ankara into the conversation. Now, Ovigwe, this fighting has been going on for about 5 weeks now, going into its 6th week. Can you provide an in-depth analysis of the ongoing conflict between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces? How has the violence evolved over the past month, particularly in the capital, Khartoum?
Yes, first of all, thank you for having me on your show. I think one important thing to mention with regards to this event in Sudan, we've seen very unfortunate, is the fact that we as international community or observers outside of Sudan knew something was going to happen in Sudan before April the 15th, because we know for a fact, if you've been following Sudan, when you have a country where essentially you have two militaries, and these two militaries are led by people who are, I would say, an image of convenience. That is Bohan leading the SAF and Hameti leading the RSF. At some point, political differences or ambition is bound to clash. And in the days leading up to April 15th, we saw the RSF packed outside of key locations in Khartoum. And of course, if there was a very effective early warning mechanism on the continent, at least within the AU, they should have known that this is not something you need to joke with. The intervention should have been at that point where there was mobilization. But it failed, it didn't work, and then, of course, talks between both sides didn't lead to any substantial outcome that prevented the conflict. But one of the main differences, I think, needs to be emphasized on why these two militaries, essentially, the military and the paramilitary RSF went to war, is because the RSF, led by Hemeti, wants a more of an official status, the RSF to be collapsed into the national army. And I think there is a lot of question as to why or why not that should happen from the SAF side. They couldn't get to any.
Why do you think there's resistance?
Of course, both men went to war.
Why do you think there's resistance to assimilate the RSF into the SAF?
Well, the RSF has a bit of a problematic history. If you go back to the conflict in Darfur, the role it played, and it has a lot of baggage in that war. There was a lot of accusations and, I would say to a large extent, evidence of crimes of war, crimes against humanity committed by the RSF. Then, it's pretty what we call the predecessor, the Janjaweed, as it was called. And for many years, the former leader of Sudan, Al-Bashir, used the RSF as its own personal militia outside of the military. So that parallel approach of both sides were bound to clash at some point.
Thank you very much, Ovigwe. Now, Dr. Tahir, this fighting has been going on for a while, and it's not the civilians that are caught in the crossfire. Last time I checked, about 600 plus people have died in the fighting. Now, could you kindly shed light on the scale of displacement caused by this conflict? The Nigerian government, for example, has sent about 5 evacuation flights have come out of Port Sudan, has been used to evacuate Nigerians caught in the crossfires. Now, how are the displaced individuals being supported, those ones that choose to remain in Khartoum, in the war zone? And what challenges do they face in terms of access to basic necessities and protection? Because the RSF seems to be using civilians as human shields, and there's also accusations that the Sudanese armed forces are shelling indiscriminately in heavily populated civilian areas. So over to you, Dr. El Tahir.
Thank you so much. Well, when it comes, there are two, we have to differentiate between three spots in the Sudan: Khartoum, Darfur, and the rest of the Sudan. The fighting in Khartoum, the capital, and in Darfur is very, very furious. Very furious fighting, extremely brutal. Both parties have very little regard to human life. And there is absolutely not any kind of a deal you could reach with these people. Be on the personal level, someone would stand in front of the RSF, say, I'm just going into the house to get something. They give him the green light, the promise that they're not going to kill him or rob him, and they do. That is just on one-to-one. And then on a larger scale, like an agreement like the Jeddah agreement, it's not worth anything. Because there is just no stop of ceasefire. When it comes to the people outside these two hotspots, Darfur and Khartoum, so according to UN, there are about 700,000 Sudanese internally displaced. Now you have to remember there were an unknown number of Syrian refugees in Sudan. Some figures are saying up to 100,000. There are 1.5 million Ethiopian and Eritrean refugees in Sudan. Of course, there is a large number of Southern Sudanese refugees in Sudan that also exceeds 1 million. There are over 100,000 Yemeni refugees. There are over 55,000 Egyptian families, not individuals, Egyptian families living and working in Sudan. So when the war broke, the level of evacuation is unprecedented, because even for us, we Sudanese, we were surprised at the number of foreigners who were living and residing in Sudan. Now, like you mentioned, the Nigerians, for example, they were evacuation programs from their respective countries and so on. The Syrian and Yemeni refugees, they are in a real limbo, because they are stranded at the borders of Egypt, where they are not allowed into the country. They are stranded at the Red Sea, where they are not allowed into Saudi Arabia. So Sudan was a country which received Syrian and Yemeni refugees. And these other Arab countries are not taking them, not taking any responsibility for them, and not showing any kind of solidarity. So that says something about the so-called Arab League and Arab solidarity. This is a real crisis for these foreign. When it comes to Sudanese internally displaced refugees, then came something which is very much to be commended and highlighted, and that is all families open for other families fleeing Khartoum. They were received generously, and they were received with a great deal of dignity, preservation of their dignity. Everyone who, they don't need to know you, receive you and all your family into their household, share the little that they have with you. So more or less, the provinces are functioning in a semi all right day to day, at least in terms of safety. Of course, Khartoum being a capital which is highly important economically for all the country. So then, of course, that has its consequences. But because Sudan is a large country, because Sudan is an agricultural country, so it will be felt, but not just yet in the same kind of severity. However, the main consequence regionally is going to be food shortages. The amount of agricultural products exported from Sudan and the amount of cattle and meat that is exported from Sudan to neighboring countries is very, very, very high. 13% of Egyptian imports are from Sudan. 26% of Saudi Arabia's imports are from Sudan. these countries are going to face food security gaps, and Ethiopia as well, and South Sudan. These are the countries which are going to be hurt directly by the failure of the upcoming agricultural season and harvest.
Thank you very much, Dr. El Tahir. Now, Ovigwe, we've heard that people in Khartoum are stuck in their homes, drinking water, food and medical supplies running out. But representatives of the warring generals met in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia for talks brokered by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in the United States, and they talked about opening up supplies and humanitarian access for the city. Have things gotten easier for residents of Khartoum? And how much succor have these Jeddah talks brought to the long-suffering people of Sudan?
It was...
sorry, Dr. El Tahir. That question is directed to the other panelist, Ovigwe.
All right. Okay.
Yes, when the talks were announced, of course, there was a lot of optimism because, just like the previous speaker mentioned, the humanitarian situation in Sudan is very dire. I mean, I was shocked to see some of the stats coming out of Khartoum just within days. You know, now we're looking at about 1 million people suddenly displaced, and I think that these are even just very conservative numbers. So when there was an announcement that both parties were meeting in Jeddah to hold talks regarding at least humanitarian condition, I saw that as very positive because of the situation in the country is very dire, and both sides need to at least work on something that would alleviate the pains and suffering of people of Sudan. Also, that is a low-hanging fruit in the sense that if they're able to agree on something, then that would set the background or the basis or foundation for more talks regarding a more sustained ceasefire or even a peace agreement. However, there are some issues that I think is complicating the Jeddah talks process. One of them is the fact that both parties still think they can win on the battlefield. And when you have belligerent groups who are very confident in military capabilities, either because they still have access to weapons and men and morale, then it's very difficult to move past humanitarian talks to a political process. On May the 12th, they agreed to provide access to civilian populations and people stuck in part of the country, and to ensure that there's free flow of aid through all the agencies working in Sudan, like the World Food Program and so on and so forth. But with the next step, which is the implementation, there's still some questions around that. And of course, what happens after the issues of humanitarian corridors have been established? Are we going to see progression into the political issues, the security issues, which are actually the underlying cause of the problems we are seeing today? I think it still remains to be seen. Some people are criticizing why Saudi Arabia was chosen. Some others are saying because the convening power of Saudi Arabia makes it a very good host for these talks. Yeah. But I think at the end of the day, the issue of the humanitarian situation that they've been able to achieve from the Jeddah talks is something positive. The rest of the talks, we can debate about that. Okay,
thank you very much, Ovigwe. Dr. El Tahir, Ovigwe feels when it comes to the humanitarian situation, the Jeddah talks have been able to move the needle a bit positively. Now, as these talks in Jeddah unfold, what are the primary objectives and motivations of the warring parties? Do you see any potential for compromise or ceasefire? And how significant is the exclusion of civilians and other armed groups from the Jeddah talks? What impact does it have on the legitimacy and inclusivity of any potential agreements reached? Because it's just the two guys that are fighting themselves that have been invited.
The purpose of the Jeddah agreement was to negotiate a ceasefire. The scope of the Jeddah declaration does not go beyond that into like a political process or stability or peace. This was not the mandate of the Jeddah Declaration as we understand it. It was about reaching a ceasefire. Well, in order to reach a successful ceasefire, some pressure must be used. That pressure was not used. That pressure of stopping the people who provide the weapons to RSF was not there. The political will from the United States and Saudi Arabia to put pressure was not there. So hence, even though it was just for peace for ceasefire deal, it failed into that. And in the ground, it didn't have any consequences. There is no ceasefire in Khartoum now. And the second thing I want to underscore is why the speaker was saying that there was a question about why Saudi Arabia. I think the inclusion of Saudi Arabia and the United States because of the weakness of the African Union. If the African Union was strong enough, African problems should be, in our understanding, be handled by Africans. And the African Union, as an organization, needs to step up to its role so that we do not have countries like Saudi Arabia with all its vested interest in the conflict, and countries, superpowers like the United States with all its superior strategic interest in the Red Sea and so on, will not be jeopardized by that if the African Union organization was a strong enough organization to handle African problems. If from the very first day of the massacre in June 2019, the African Union had taken strong measures against these two generals, we would not have been in this current situation now. The African Union organization has and is still a very important responsibility for the stability, security, democracy in Africa, which they have yet to start exercising.
Thank you, Dr. El Tahir. Now, just before we go on a break, Ovigwe, quick one. Dr. El Tahir mentioned the failure of the African Union to mediate. We also talk about, African problems, African solutions to African problems. So what are people saying in other African capitals about the Jeddah talks and the situation in Sudan? What's the African Union doing and the IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, on the situation in Sudan?
Yes, I would agree to some extent with what the previous speaker said. She's very correct to say the African Union does have a role. The African Union should have stepped in forcefully at the very beginning to ensure that we don't get to the situation we're in today. And I completely agree with that. That is why I even opened my commentary by saying, if we had a very good, early warning mechanism in place, we wouldn't be where we are today when the RSF was mobilizing to Khartoum, prior to April the 15th. But that said, we also have to recognize that when it comes to African security challenges, especially where there's multiplicity of vested interests from serious powers, they always tend to sideline the continent, the African Union and other actors on the continent. I give you a good example would be the case of Libya, for instance. The African Union was essentially begging the Europeans and the Americans to actually to be the platform to have those talks. The then president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, was flying back and forth, trying to get. Then he was the AU chairperson, trying to get an African voice in those talks, and they were completely sidelined. So this is what is happening in Sudan as well. There's a perception or there's an approach to Africa that splits the continent to where the African Union should have a say and where it cannot have a say, and Sudan happens to be one of those places. Sudan as a country, of course, a lot of vested interest from the Gulf countries, from Saudi Arabia, from the UAE, and it is very tricky to have people who have such a vested interest being playing arbiter or mediator in this context.
So what are the other African countries looking at? And looking at the precedent from history, why do they still allow this sort of things happen?
Come again, I didn't hear you clearly.
What are the other African leaders looking at? And why do they allow this sort of, what's that? I'm looking for the right word now. Giving our problems to other people to solve for us. Why do they allow this normally? The other African heads of states? Outsourcing our problems to other people.
Yeah, the thing is, if you have two parties in conflict and you don't have enough leverage to get them into a room, or at least their representative into a room to speak face to face, then no matter how much goodwill you have, no matter how much credibility or legitimacy that you have, it's not going to happen. And that is why I said Saudi Arabia has convening power. It has convening power the way the African Union probably does not have or has not been able to exercise its convening power. What the African Union did following the outbreak of the conflict, or at least of this recent conflict, April 15th, was there is a trilateral mechanism in place. That is the African Union, the UN, and IGAD. That trilateral mechanism for Sudan was even expanded to include the European Union. The Saudis were in the talks. There was a very big talk hosted by Musa Faki Mahamat, who is the AU Commission chairperson. Yes. So when he had that gathering within the first week, I mean, that was the beginning of still the biggest multilateral process till date when regards to the issue of Sudan. But that is one thing. The main thing is you can gather all of the parties all you want. The most important people to stop the fighting are the two men, General Bohan and General Hemeti. And if you do not have enough political influence over these two men, whether you're the African Union or an African president, you would not be able to mediate.
Very true.
How this just happened to have that kind of convening power, and that is why the talks are holding in Jeddah today.
Thank you very much, Ovigwe. It's a fine place to go on a break. When we come back, we'll be looking at solutions and suggestions on how to stop this conflict between the SAF and the RSF in Sudan. Do stay with us. This is Secure the Continent. You're welcome back to Secure the Continent, and we've been discussing the security situation in Sudan and the pathway to peace in the country. And I still have on the show with me Dr. Majduline Tahir, expert in Sudanese geopolitics and advocate for democracy and human rights. He's joining us from Norway. And I also have Ovigwe Eguegu, policy analyst at Development Reimagined, joining us from the Turkish capital at Ankara. Thank you very much for staying with us. Now, Dr. Tahir, the Sudanese Armed Forces has reiterated that the conflict is an internal matter to be resolved by completely dissolving the Rapid Support Forces. It has gone ahead to declare the paramilitary force as a rebel group and might not be in the mood for negotiations. They're talking tough. What's the progress with the Salva Kiir-led IGAD peace talks, and why does General Burhan prefer the South Sudanese as the preferred party for negotiations?
Well, I'm not quite sure if he prefers them as a negotiating party or not, but I know that we do. People of the Sudan, they do. We have enough reasons to be very skeptical to any kind of Arab-led negotiations because of the conflict of interest, because of the conflict in their interest. We know very well that South Sudan, first of all, is not just a neighboring country. South Sudan is Sudan as well. It's an independent country and everything, but up until 2011, we were the same people. There is enough northern Sudanese living in the south, and vice versa. So specifically, South Sudan is the party which we trust the most in these negotiations, but also because the future of these two countries is very much, our interests are very much entrenched into each other's, and our history, our culture, and the way we move forward. So that gives the legitimacy for the talks in Juba. And then when it comes to, we wish, despite the SAF having in its leadership extremely corrupt, brutal former Bashir allies like Burhan and members of the security committee of Bashir, who are heading the SAF now, it is, after all, the national army of the Sudan. It is not a paramilitary. These are actual professional army officers who are corrupt. Yes, they are brutal. They have a lot of blood in there, but they are actually army officers. And for that, and only for that, that gives them a form of legitimacy. And we do not want the militia, total militia with no army training, completely based, started as a tribal group, which what it is a militia. The RSF is not paramilitary, it is a militia, and it is a rebel group, and it is based on a tribe. Its leadership from Hemeti to most of its leaders did not go to military school. They do not have any training. Indeed, some of them, they don't even have school education. So that militia, if we wish, if Burhan had managed to defeat that militia in time, but he didn't. And he didn't before 15th of April, and he didn't after the 15th of April, because of the weaknesses in the armed forces, and because of the splits in the armed forces, which we see now with all these changes in the leadership in the last week, and including today. So this is the situation. We're very frustrated that they are not. They didn't manage to control the militia, and we are extremely saddened by the fact that our national army is so weak that a militia like the Janjaweed militia, like the RSF, cannot. It takes them so long in order to defeat them, we do believe that it should be defeated. It should be some form of becoming part of the national army, and the national army itself the leadership of that army should go, because this is a leadership which has lost all integrity, especially after bombardment of civilians in order to get members of RSF.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tahir. Now, still talking, Ovigwe, about the military situation in Sudan. It's been a month since fighting broke out, and the calculations seem largely the same. So do you think, as fighting goes on, there's anything that can change their incentives, perhaps weapons drying up? What's your analysis of the military capabilities of the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces? Because I understand the Sudanese armed forces has the numerical strength. And how does this balance of power impact the livelihood of a lasting ceasefire and perhaps the prospects for future stability? Because Dr. Tahir just said, you know, it's a disgrace that a militia that involved from the Janjaweed will be, you know, still holding the Sudanese people and the Sudanese armed forces hostage even after a month, a professionally trained army.
Yes, it's quite surprising from one perspective. A standing army, professional army, can't defeat a militia or a paramilitary as it was described, has been described. But you also have to look at the process of formation of the RSF and where it has been used. For instance, the RSF was deployed in the Yemeni conflict, for instance, fighting for the Saudis, right? They are battle tested. They are very well experienced. Very, very agile, very mobile. You could see that in the opening of the conflict on the 15th and the 16th. The speed, it's really a rapid support force. I mean that it showed that it was not by mistake. But at the same time, the Sudanese army, just like the previous speaker mentioned, should have been able to put down this challenge. But it did try, even though it had air support. It was able to bomb some of the RSF position. But the flexibility and agility of the RSF was actually a major problem, and also the familiarity of the RSF of the terrain. So this is not even this might be a militia that came up from a region of the country, but they are very familiar with the whole of the country, and it was quite and also very well armed and equipped as well. So it's quite a challenge, and the stalemate to a large extent isn't surprising, even though a lot of people expected it to not have lasted this long. However, going forward, if you look at the dynamics and the fact that the SAF and the Sudanese government or the state isn't able to pull in allies, I mean, the Egyptians seems to be supporting the state or a little bit, and the RSF generally as a militia would get its weapons from the black market and all of that. I think if you let this play out a little bit longer, the SAF is very likely to start getting upper hand if the countries around Sudan really start taking this situation seriously, because the fracture of the Sudanese state is going to be problematic for everybody, not just people in Sudan. And God forbid that is the scenario that people in Sudan and those in the Horn of Africa do not want to happen. So when we're talking about a way forward, what preserves the integrity of the Sudanese state has to come first. Its national army has to be respected and given the legitimacy it deserves, both inside the country and outside of the country. And then we can begin to talk about political settlements outside, with these conditionalities or with these factors on the table.
Thank you very much, Ovigwe. Dr. Tahir, Ovigwe just talked about the consequences, and you did mention how important Sudan is to that region, to its neighbors, and its importance. So let's talk about the consequences. What are the potential long-term consequences if a resolution is not reached promptly? And how could the continued conflict in Sudan impact stability, governance, and the overall socio-economic development of the country? Right now, the fighting is restricted to Khartoum, Omdurman, and Darfur. If this continues, do you see spreading, or we have a situation, a Congo-like situation, where Eastern DRC is restive, and then the other regions like Kinshasa and Katanga have relative stability? Is that the long-term prognosis for Sudan?
Well, as part of the civil movement, despite the very many knockdowns on the civil movement, I do believe that the civil movement of the Sudan will still be able to regroup, reorganize, and form a kind of on-the-ground peace and on-the-ground development.
Yeah, but the international community, sorry to interrupt you, they're not even inviting them for these talks. Nobody seems to be talking to them at this point.
At this point, at previous point, and in future points, this movement, which has millions of people, this is there. If you look at it, there is the military, there are the Islamists, and there is the civil movement. The civil movement is the most organized. The civil movement is in numbers, in pure numbers, is the most the largest number. in terms of organization, they are organizing themselves now in Khartoum under the bombardment, doing an amazing job in connecting together, in providing all kinds of services, from security services, doing the rounds of protecting the houses, terracing around neighborhoods, so that the army, the RSF, could not come into the neighborhood. They are doing that in Darfur. They are doing that in Khartoum as well. They are providing shelter and food and water to refugees, and they're also treating the injured. So they are doing that. This is what is going to build the Sudan. This is in practice. This has been happening in Darfur, and it did bring peace in practice. We do not believe that the international community will ever give us the recognition and the legitimacy that we want. And therefore, we are way past the international community. We do not believe in these mechanisms. These mechanisms have been going in Sudan and in other places. Okay, if you look, for example, at Syria, negotiation after negotiation after negotiation. And today, Al-Assad is welcomed into the Arab League. So all these years, all these people, millions of people, and they are back in the same situation, because the people, when you let go of your own fate into the hands of others, then you will never have a good future, because others have no interest in your prosperity and development and so on. But we understand that, and we are very, very keen on and aware that our development and our struggle, we are going to take that ourselves, and we are doing it, and that we will succeed, because otherwise no one ever is going to give it to us.
Thank you very much, Dr.
We make it ourselves.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. El Tahir. We're fast running out of time, so Ovigwe, if you can, in less than 2 minutes. Dr. El Tahir feels solution has to come from within, because the ordinary civilians in Sudan are greater in numbers than the warring belligerents. Now, in your own expert opinion, what are the most crucial steps that needs to be taken to achieve a lasting peace in Sudan? Are there any lessons that can be learned from similar conflicts in the region or elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I think first of all, I want to actually take some time to say I completely agree with what the lady spoke before me was saying. This has to be endogenous. Peace has to be endogenous. It has to come from within. If you let your country to become a battlefield or a theater of great power politics, or even middle power politics, that's really what is happening in Sudan today. It's mostly the middle powers playing around with lives and property of Sudanese and their country. From my perspective, one of the most important things that needs to happen, if you say the next, what happened tomorrow morning, I would say it has to be humanitarian corridor should be respected. The lives and livelihood of Sudanese people should not be, in such dire state, and that is the most expedient. Maybe the Jeddah talks is able to achieve that. We'll have to see. But beyond that, countries within the region need to step up. Need to step up in the sense that they need to step up to their responsibility to ensure that they find leverage, however possible, to get both General Burhan and Hemeti to sit down and lay down the weapons. If you look at South Sudan, for instance, South Sudan was an ongoing issue and to a large extent, it's still a very fragile society. Once we allow this personality politics and you put the security of a country and stability of a country in the hands of two people, and these two people certainly do not agree on anything that could also have in South Sudan, then you are in for repeated conflict. If there is a cycle of violence, maybe the best thing for Sudan is for both men to step aside and a whole new group of leaders can come forward. that might just be the best thing, because if you look at South Sudan, for instance, that didn't happen. We still maintain, Salva Kiir and Riek Machar to be somewhere
a power sharing
deal and all of that, and we still had repeat conflicts, right? So for me, if you look at the Sudanese context, the option is not just Hemeti and Bohan. There was a civilian government before all of this.
Sorry, Ovigwe, we do have to go at this point. Thank you very much, Dr. Majduline Tahir, expert on Sudanese geopolitics, and also thank you, Ovigwe Eguegu, policy analyst at Development Reimagined. I did appreciate your contribution and time on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
To make Sudan a democratic state is essential to address the underlying political and economic issues that fuel the conflict. A sustainable solution will require long-term commitment from all stakeholders, including the Sudanese government, regional powers, and the international community. Thank you very much for being a part of today's program. I'm Gbenga Aborowa. Remember to stay safe all the time. See you next time on Secure the Continent. Bye-bye.